Has this administration had more executive overreach than Joe Biden's term in office so far?
That's a good question.
See, I don't even know how this is difficult, right?
It's difficult because they're very, very different. We have been continuously expanding executive authority for decades, and we've gotten to the point where the president is too powerful.
What did Biden do that was like the great accelerator of this problem that you saw that was so shocking to you? You mentioned DEI. Maybe are you going to mention the student loans?
I almost quit my job and joined like a political action litigation group over the vaccine mandate he tried to push through OSHA.
The problem it seems to be is that there's an unwillingness from some centrists, I have to say, to deal in the merits, in the weeds, and in the good faith of the people behind these actions. So Trump is running off emergency actions in bad faith. He's running on fake emergencies. This was a real emergency. And guess what? At no point did Biden say, I'm not going to listen to the Supreme Court. Hey, folks, please like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to check out my newsletter. Information is in the description. I respect you as an intellect. I think that you're probably an exceptional lawyer. You work for an awesome firm. I'm sure your clients were well served, and every penny of your billables was worth it for them, and that I hope that you're going to get a great result in your outcome there. I think that we're in a unique moment of crisis in the country. Now that your trial is over, what I want to do is revisit whether or not you agree with me on that, whether or not you still think that Donald Trump, gun to your head, would be better to run the country right now than Kamala Harris, which is where we left off the last conversation, and basically assess the situation. Are things going about as good as you thought they would? What's happening? And so I guess I'll ask you where you want to start.
I can map out a little bit of a response, and then we can figure out what's interesting. So when I talked to Destiny like a million years ago, one of the topics was like Trump optimism. And things have clearly not gone as well as they could have. I think, and even like the most diehard. No, not the most diehard. Sorry, that's wrong. I do really diehard people are like living and dying on this. But I think if you talk to someone like Richard Hania, right, he's going to be he's been on like a vocal anti-Trump kick recently because it's like a lot of things that showed a lot of promise for people who want, generally speaking, a smaller government, or want less DEI, or want secure borders, have not played out the way we had hoped, or even though there's been some progress, the methods have been, unconstitutional or problematic, or there's been a number of issues there. So I think it has not been something that I'm happy about. I'm glad I didn't vote for him. In terms of whether we spend all our time talking about what Trump does right or wrong. We've rarely, I don't think ever, spoken about why the left was so unappealing in that election, and why they were, to me, so disqualified. So I don't know that I've changed my mind about the gun to my head scenario, because the problems I saw in the left do not appear to have been solved. And I mean, I voted for Biden to replace Trump, specifically hoping, and this is going to lead into the constitutional crisis conversation, that the excesses of the first Trump administration would be the clear signal to the populace that we have given the executive branch too much power, and it will be wielded by people you don't like, and we need to ratchet it back. And the Biden administration's decision to go the absolute opposite direction and just ratchet up executive power to levels I had not previously seen, which is now the world we live in, was a real bummer. The DEI stuff was a real problem for me. The expansion of the federal government was a real problem for me. So I don't know that I don't know that I would change my mind about the gun to my head scenario. I am very glad I voted for neither of them, because I did not want either of them to be president, and I'm pretty confident that that was the right call.
If your overall problem is executive overreach, Do you think it's fair to say that in recent years, this administration, this Trump administration, well, first I'll ask this question. Has this administration had more executive overreach than Joe Biden's term in office so far?
That's a good question.
You see, I don't even know how this is difficult, right?
It's difficult because they're very, very different. Trump's excesses have been very in your face, and the power grabs that he's made have been mostly at the expense of the judiciary, that seems to be the fight he's picking. Like, because when you talk about like power grabs within the executive branch, he's the president. He's already the president of the executive branch. Unless you're saying it's a constitutional crisis for him to seize power over executive agencies. If you're saying that, that's a different conversation.
So I think it's both. So I think the interbranch stuff, there's never been a worse president in the last 80 years. So we're talking about Donald Trump with respect to Congress. Let's just look at a couple of core examples. He has unconstitutionally frozen spending that has been appropriated by Congress. That's a clear infringement on Congress's prerogatives. Mm-hmm. The tariffs here, a clear overstepping of Congress's prerogatives to set tariffs where there's limited roles for emergency tariffs, but Congress has the power to set tariffs at their at whatever they want to set it at. Other areas where Congress has set up agencies to do certain functions, and Trump is defying the clear expressed intent of Congress in establishing, for example, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, establishing the Department of Education, and is doing his best to frustrate these clear congressional aims and the exercise of Congress's authority. So that's just on Congress. On judicial, I don't even have to go into judicial. I think you would already grant judicial that clearly Trump is overreaching in terms of the executive with respect to the judicial authority more than any president in recent memory, especially Joe Biden. So what even is the argument here on interbranch?
I think the play in the joints is going to be that you and I likely have a different opinion regarding the president's constitutional authority to direct agencies and delegate his power. Like, I think it sounds like what you would say is that's a congressional issue. To me, that's a symptom of the government being too big. Like, we have the federal government doing things that it shouldn't be doing, and as a result, now you've delegated all this power to the executive, and now the executive wants to wield it, which is upsetting, but it was delegated to the executive branch, which is a bummer if you don't want the executive branch to control it. And then with the other kind of nuance is that foreign policy stuff is very tricky in terms of in branch versus branch combat, because like, as you said, there's certain things that are delegated to Congress. Foreign policy is it's not totally exclusive, but it's a pretty strongly executive area. And then just to put a bow on one thing you said, this is interesting, the tariff issue, that law that provides the president emergency powers drives me crazy, because emergency is 100% in the eye of the presidential beholder, and it gets used for all kinds of crazy shit constantly. It's kind of like the Alien Enemies Act, where it's like, I don't think it's an interbranch problem. I think it's a bad law problem. Like, Congress wrote a law. The law is not a good law. We really should fix the law, but they did write it. So it's not like when he uses the Alien Enemies Act, he's usurping Congress's power. The power is there. It was granted. The problem is it's a dumb law, and this is a point in case why we really need to trim back the laws that we have and get rid of or modify or modernize some of these laws that are sitting around and then get picked up and used for purposes that we don't like.
So if this is your analysis of Trump's oversteps, which I consider to be oversteps, I totally disagree with your framing that he's following the Alien Enemies Act. Every single judge who has confronted the alien enemies, including the one who just said that his invocation was, or that the term physical incursion includes what Trump is doing, that's a minority position so far. There have been, I think, 4 or 5 other courts that have said the otherwise. Every court that has determined that issue has said he's violating the Alien Enemies Act by not providing due process under the Alien Enemies Act and certainly under the due process clause of the Constitution. So I want to be clear. I disagree with your assessment about whether Trump is following the statutory
we talked about the Alien Enemies Act before, and I think we actually agreed. Like, and forgive me if I'm rehashing the conversation incorrectly. Our prediction that I think both agreed on was, if the Alien Enemies Act gets to the Supreme Court, they will say due process is required, and we both agreed on that. And they will say that the determination of whether or not there is an invasion is inherently executive to the point that a court cannot comment on it because it's non-justiciable and it's a political question.
You said that. I thought that they might. You had a high degree of confidence in that. I wasn't as sure about you on that. Now, as I'm seeing more of the cases, it seems like more people are saying that this is not a political question. And in fact, in the case Ludecky that we were talking about, I believed in that case it wasn't a political question. They had to decide what it meant for, they had to have a determination about what the statutory term war meant in that context in Ludecky itself. Mm-hmm. And the courts have, as I predicted, taken the Ludecky approach and said, yeah, there might be deference on some of the facts. Even the case out of Texas, they said we can't question any of the facts as set forth in the proclamation. That's a little bit more deferential to executive, but they still interpreted the facts and applied them to the statutory terms, doing the normal thing that courts do and interpreting what the law means and what physical incursion means. And even determining, as this one court that favored Trump did, what physical incursion meant isn't utilizing the political question doctrine. It is interpreting what this means, and it's not, strictly speaking, deferring to the president. It's just ruling in the president's favor. But I want to take a step back. I don't. So
you want to put some money on that if it goes to the Supreme Court?
I don't know. I can't predict what will happen to the Supreme Court. I don't know. I know what I believe is the right answer. If it goes to the Supreme Court, I think it's possible that they'll go political question, or they'll take this Texas route, which is like, we can't question the underlying facts, but we do have to apply what's going on. I think that's more likely. I think that they will apply some test to see if it fits the statutory definition of physical incursion, of invasion, and of war, just like Ludecky did, and just as binding Supreme Court precedent says. I don't think that they'll wholesale do it. So if you want to take a bet on that, we could take a bet, $100.
Yeah, I'm down. I'm pretty confident that this court is going to say due process, but no, they're going to say it's non-justiciable. Like the question of whether or not there is an invasion is non-justiciable.
I don't think so. I think that'll be either 5-4 or 6-3 in favor that it is justiciable. Maybe Trump gets
and here's why. And this is the fun. And I'm saying this more as a lead into like the fundamental constitutional question, which is a really interesting one. Imagine there really was an invasion in the way that you and I would use the term. Like not like a Trump invasion, like a honest to God invasion, right? Like there's boats landing on the in New York City,
from China,
they're storming the stores, right? Trump's like, okay, we're going to start detaining and deporting people. Like I'm doing X, Y, and Z thing to respond, and then a district court says, wait, hold on, you can't do that. We, the court, need to rule on whether or not there's an invasion before you can respond. Like the premise is so crazy, because this is clearly not the sort of thing a court should be doing. Like now, what I think you're getting at is like there's a lot of indicia that this is a sham, which I think I would agree with, but I don't think the court is going to want to rule that it can determine whether or not it's a sham. I think it's going to want to say, no, this is
so
the
why
type
can't it reach
of
the due
question
process
that the court is uniquely badly positioned to rule on.
So why can't it reach the due process issues? I mean, by that logic, I mean,
I would agree with you can reach the due process issue. I think that's what they would reach. I think they will say.
Why would they? Under that theory, like, why can you question? It's so ridiculous that the court would put in procedures and interpret what the term invasion or physical incursion means, but it's not ridiculous.
Due process is such a minor barrier in that situation. Like due process for a deportation is A, not that much. B, it doesn't prevent you from arresting everybody. So like when someone says, for example, like it's a due process, like,
you have to give
it's not
them
a due
habeas
process
petitions.
Violation.
You have to give all these people hearings. You have to give all these people hearings. You have to give them a couple of weeks at least to get their petitions in, and more than 24 hours. So you're stopping the president from deporting all these people in seconds.
Habeas is a separate question than the Alien Enemies Act. Like that is legitimately a separate question. Like that's a procedural vehicle which has been suspended in the past. In a real invasion, I imagine it would be suspended.
By whom? By whom?
We can talk. Well, it typically, at least historically, it is suspended by the president, and then the suspension is blessed by Congress.
That happened one time with Abraham Lincoln.
So, well, there were other suspensions. I don't quite recall if they followed the same fact pattern. I think every time Congress blessed them, either after the fact or at the time. I don't like during World War II.
Congress,
era. I don't quite recall.
So maybe there's some limited degree of like when you're literally on the beaches and stuff that there's like some temporary amount of time, whatever. But I just want to take a step back and say, regardless of our predictions of where the Supreme Court's going to lie here, like taking this analysis and to be clear where I stand, I do not believe that Trump is complying with the statutory commands of Congress. I do not believe that many of these claims are non-justiciable. I don't think the tariff issue is non-justiciable. I don't think the Alien Enemies Act issue is non-justiciable in terms of the right outcome here. But even taking a step back,
you think the tariff issue is justiciable?
100%. Wait. So anytime the Congress puts an emergency provision of any kind in its statutes, now, no matter what, the courts have to adhere to what the executive says is an emergency. Congress can't develop.
No, I'm just saying that like it's very clear that the practice under that law is that an emergency is whatever the president says it is. I think we have like 36 or 37 current emergencies. Like it's an endless litany of emergencies. My favorite example of that, by the way, was that Trump declared a border emergency, right, during his first term, and that's how he did the wall. That's how he did like portions of the wall. Then Biden took over, and with the numbers getting significantly worse, declared that the emergency was over.
Wait, no,
because there was no emergency.
No, he didn't. He took over during COVID. He stopped the emergency on his day one when border crossings were not at their height. No, he was.
So I whether or not I might have gotten the timing slightly wrong, but he declared the emergency is over. The numbers get historically bad under Biden. There is no more emergency. Trump takes office, there's an emergency again. And the reason why? Because emergency has nothing to do with the facts on the ground and everything to do with what the president says. It's a very, very stupid law, and there should be some limitations on it. I don't think that's how it's been practiced. I think presidents have declared emergencies for everything under the sun.
Well, just because the president gets deference on some issues, I don't think it implies that it's non-justiciable, that anything related to emergency is non-justiciable. I think those are different issues. But I want to take a step back and look at the analysis that you just gave about potentially why there's no constitutional crisis and we just have dumb laws. Under that framework, right, where...
Oh, no, I think there's a constitutional crisis, right? But
okay. But under that framework, like, examine any of Joe Biden's actions that you take issue with or you think are executive overreach. Under that kind of, like, deferential of a standard in terms of the interbranch conflict, because we haven't even gotten into the executive overreach into personal liberties. What we're talking about right now is executive overreach into interbranch separation of powers issues. What thing can you identify that I can apply this incredibly deferential unitary executive framework that you've just deployed for President Trump to President Biden's actions, and not in doing so say that it's who cares, it's the power that Congress delegated to him? I mean, really point to one action by by Biden that you think that I couldn't analyze in that way and say it's not really a problem, or it's not really a branch issue.
You're misstating the thrust of my analysis. It was not to point out that there isn't a constitutional crisis, because as you know, I think there is one. Okay. It was trying to point out that there are nuances to Trump's actions that I would take into account, which I don't think you do in trying to weigh the severity of executive overreach, to weigh the severity of pushing against the boundaries. So, like, for example, I would find the denying due process. That's a serious issue for me. Declaring that there's an invasion, I don't think has an issue of a constitutional dimension, because I think the president can do that. So we would look at the same. We would look at the same facts. We would agree that certain acts, like the denial of due process, do trigger a constitutional dimension, but other acts you and I might disagree on because we interpret them differently.
So I think that that's a huge problem looking at the analysis. Like, with the president, for example, the president has the power to indict. The president has the power to prosecute. Mm-hmm. If the president just indicted every single member of Congress and charged them with treason, let's say the president did that, right? And you would agree, he has the power to do that. He has the power to charge all these Congress people with treason if he wanted to. He has the power to control the Department of Justice, and under unitary executive theory, would you say the president all of a sudden indicting every single member of Congress and every single judge in the country with treason, would you say that would be a constitutional crisis?
Yeah, obviously.
So it can't just be the analysis, well, is it technically in the president's authority to declare an emergency? Is it technically within the president's authority to indict someone? That can't be the start and end of our analysis about whether something is a constitutional crisis. Things like good faith and what they're planning and intentions matter a lot in terms of our priors about whether something is a constitutional crisis.
But it is, I mean, it's not the end all be all, but it is an important part of the analysis. For example, if a district court ordered the administration to open negotiations with Cuba, right? I would have no problem with the administration disobeying that order, because I don't believe a court has the power to order the administration to open negotiations with Cuba. I don't think that is a thing the court can do. I don't think it's within the court's judicial powers to order the president to do that.
You disagree with Marbury versus Madison?
No.
It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. That's what Marbury versus Madison held. So if the Supreme Court said, yeah, the district court does have that authority, you would say...
I didn't say Supreme Court, I said district court.
Okay, but let's say the district court says that. Trump appeals it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, the district court does have that power. Would you say Trump should follow it?
Then you would have a legitimate constitutional crisis, but you'd have a constitutional crisis because the Supreme Court is wrong.
Okay,
that would be the origin of the crisis.
Okay, but do you agree with Marbury versus Madison in that sense and say that what the law is what the Supreme Court says?
I do not think it's exclusive. I think that obviously the Congress and the president weigh in on constitutionality all the time, and they talk about legal interpretation all the time and have throughout our history. I think that the courts do have a unique role there because of Marbury versus Madison and his progeny. What I'm saying is, the court, and thank God for originalists, because they're typically better on these kind of issues. The court has limitations on its constitutional authority.
Agreed.
It can't just say, I can order you to open negotiations with Cuba, because there is nothing justiciable about that. And that is a power that is almost purely executive. Like, I'm not even sure Congress couldn't order the president to do that.
But who decides these issues, right? Like, so you have that opinion, and I might even agree. Like, I do think that there are certain things that the courts can't order the Trump administration to do. But the question is, who decides when the court is wrong such that the president can disobey the court?
And typically, it is the court. But what I'm saying is, it is not quite that simple, because the tension between the branches is how these things are resolved. Like, that is what happens, is that sometimes there is tension. I would agree with you, by the way, the tension is higher now than, I think you said 80 years?
Arbitrary amount of years, but yeah, 80 years.
Oh, arbitrary. Yeah, I mean, I think you would have to go back like an Andrew Jackson, or like you'd have to pick like a historical period where there was like real tension between the court and the president to find something analogous to this level of tension. So I would agree with you that this tension is very high. And I'm bothered, and I'm not saying that every order that Trump has given, I think, falls into this category. I just think there is a category of order, particularly if it's from a lower court. From the Supreme Court, less likely, but there are categories of order that the president probably shouldn't follow.
Yeah, but the thing is, here's my problem with this. A couple things. One is, I do want to address this issue of like Supreme Court versus district court, like preference scale that people have. The Constitution says the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. That the judicial power is held not just by the Supreme Court. The judicial power is held by the inferior courts that Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So the judicial order from a district court is an exercise of the judicial power of the United States. Now, addressing the kind of issue, I even think the fact that we're bringing up the notion of judicial overreach in the executive branch is such a preposterous thing and playing into the Trump's role here. Like, if the issue is no one is respecting the executive branch and we have a fear of judicial overreach in the executive branch, that is not our problem right now. That is not a problem at all. This Supreme Court has been so deferential to the executive branch with Trump versus United States, with decisions that respect, and now probably rolling back on Humphrey's executor and other limits on the president's removal authority. Like, we are not in a situation where the executive branch's prerogatives are being attacked by the courts or by Congress. We are at the absolute height. The president has never had as much authority as he currently does. And so we are nowhere near an issue of judicial overstepping. And so the fact that we're like even saying that this is a problem currently is ridiculous to me. The Supreme Court, even in the order for Kilmar Berger Garcia, is recognizing that the court can't order it to do anything it wants. And so I just don't like, there's a crisis right now, not because of overreach into the executive powers or that Congress is passing stupid laws, but because the president is overstepping his statutory constitutional authorities and is facing some resistance in the courts because what he's doing is illegal. That's the crisis.
I'm laughing a little bit, and unfortunately, I don't have receipts for it. But and the reason I'm laughing is that your buddy Josiah did an interview with me a while back.
Yeah, I know. He thinks
apparently apparently the audio got lost, and one of the traps he tried to lay for me was about judicial overreach. So it's funny because in the two conversations I've had with the Live and Learn team, I've had the trap of there's too much judicial overreach, and now that there's not enough judicial overreach.
It is funny, right? Because anyone who watches our show will know that we get super heated on this, and he'll say things like the courts need to be the bitch of the president in the Congress. So I actually think he's being a little bit of a he's being a little inconsistent here when he's complaining about Trump's overreaches vis-a-vis the courts, because I do think that, I'm not in favor of us disobeying the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, Josiah's talking about like non-compliance by the executive. And this is exactly the issue. I think that when we give the power for the executive itself to decide when there's an emergency, whether the Supreme Court can issue an order, whether they have to listen to the Supreme Court, now we're approaching like king areas. And when you have people like Stephen Miller saying, yeah, we should suspend habeas corpus, yeah, we should impeach all these judges, like all of their minions are saying don't listen to the courts, like this is a 5-alarm fire. And I don't think that we need to make room for people who are saying, oh no, like the courts are overstepping. Like that's just not the problem that we're presented right now.
Well, I think it's interesting because we're talking about like different prescriptions of the problem. To me, and this is somebody who like I've told you, like I started voting for Democrats like circa 2000, right? So like I was 17 in 2000, so it wasn't to 2004. But when I politically came of age, I was like a freshman in New York City when 9/11 happened, right? So then like it's like, okay, week 1 in the city, boom, Patriot Act, we're in an emergency, right? And what's happened in my political life is that there has been a never-ending string of emergencies. And the solution to every single one of them has been to expand executive authority. And when I say that there's a slow-moving constitutional crisis, I don't mean that Trump isn't an accelerant or isn't making it uniquely worse in the ways that he is. What I'm saying is we have been continuously expanding executive authority for decades, always thinking we're doing the right thing. And we've gotten to the point where the president is too powerful. There is too many things.
But you're a unitary executive theorist, right? You're in favor of the president having complete control of the executive branch, of, I'm sure, getting rid of Humphrey's executor, right?
Well, I believe that the president should have control of the executive branch, and the executive branch should have jurisdiction over like a third as many things. Like unitary executive theory doesn't, like the problem that we have right now is the pendulum swing. If you look at the kind of like classically Democrat version of the executive, they want to delegate huge amounts of power to the executive branch through agencies, but they don't want the president to have full control of them. So you have a hugely broad executive branch with a president without total control. When you talk about executive theorists, I'm not talking about Stephen Miller or like some political actor, I'm talking about like an intellectual executive theorist. What they're talking about is the president having near total control over a much smaller sphere. My problem with the way that our country has developed is that we're doing the worst possible aspects of both. We've maximized the scope Now we have an originalist court that believes in unitary executive theory and a president that wants total control, and the scope is at its maximum. And that's untenable. It can't be both. You have to, like, you can't swing back and forth between these extremes.
So what was the big fear of, so let's talk about some of the specific overreaches, because now I want to bring it into the comparators. What did Biden do that was like the great accelerator of this problem that you saw that was like that was so shocking to you? You mentioned DEI. Maybe are you going to mention the student loans?
I almost quit my job and joined like a political like action litigation group over the vaccine mandates he tried to push through OSHA. Like that was insane. I've never like to say that with a stroke of the pen, the president can make health decisions for 100 million Americans with importantly, Congress not approving. Like without congressional imprimatur, he can do this. That's insane.
Wait a second.
Like,
so
those are conditions. It was struck down.
Those are conditions on employment within the federal. So the OSHA requirements were for employers, correct?
How about the one with 100 plus employees?
100 million employees. Wait, I don't know which of the OSHA regulations affected that.
The one I'm referring to is that went through OSHA, so I'm not sure if it was an executive order or an agency or prerogative. But it was not the one that was affecting federal employees. It was the one that affected employers of 100 people or more.
Yeah,
where you either.
So that's a question. So OSHA is allowed to put in some some requirements that affect employers of that size, and the language that Congress used was quite capacious, was very capacious, in fact. And so that's a statutory interpretation question. But if true, right? If it were true, right, like that the problem in the case of Trump is too capacious congressional language. Surely it's true for an actual crisis, the COVID, where millions of Americans died, and where there's, by the way, alternatives under the OSHA regulations. You don't have to get the vaccine. You could have done more testing.
If it had been Trump and he had said it was ivermectin, would you have the same view?
Of what? Of whether or not he had the power
100
to
million,
do so?
Everyone has to take ivermectin, or they can't go to their work anymore.
Yeah, I think you could challenge it in litigation. So this is how you could challenge it in litigation.
Well, damn straight you challenge it in litigation.
No. So this is where I would say that there's a potentially difference. Number one, if you can show that the vaccine is detrimental to your health and won't actually solve anything, or that, for example, ivermectin, that there's no basis to conclude that this is, I think actually that what's the case, Johnson, the vaccine case back in the day, that established that it's okay.
The one for the states have authority?
Yeah, it's the Massachusetts case. Someone knows it in the chat. You guys know the case. I think it's Johnson. It's something like that. But so vaccine mandates are allowed under U.S. binding precedent, and I don't think it should be rational basis. What's that? For
states.
Well, in terms of an individual rights perspective, that would apply both to the states and to the federal government. Now, the question is, does Congress have the authority to regulate these kinds of employers? But that's kind of obviated by the fact that these OSHA regulations in general apply to those employers. So I assume that the Article 1 problem has been resolved already in favor of OSHA having some say, if it's the case that they can require certain safety requirements in general of these employers. I'm not going to assume there's a difference there in terms of vaccine requirements. All I'm going to say is there an individual rights problem? It's not Johnson & Johnson. It's someone get the actual case, please. If you search vaccine mandate case, it's out of Massachusetts, I believe.
The thing is, it's a very serious, and I know we talk about this case all the time, so I don't want to beat the dead horse, but it's a very serious Youngstown Steel type problem, where the president is acting unilaterally in an area where he does not have congressional authority, in an area that does not seem like he should have this authority. Because when we talk about states versus federal government, I 100% agree with you that states have and should have the power to make vaccine mandates. Congress, I would agree, though it is a closer call.
Jacobson's the case.
The president acting alone, obviously not. And thankfully, the court agreed with me and went to major questions doctrine. But that was to my mind, a wild overreach by an executive acting alone.
wait a second. So if you're saying if Congress passed a law that said employers of this size, if they said must comply with the vaccine mandates as issued by the President of the United States, you think that would be an Article 1 problem? Not what's the Article 1 problem there?
No, I don't. This is like a rabbit hole. We can go down if you want to. I do not think it is an Article 1 problem. I do not think it's an Article 1 problem because we have overly expansive interpretations of the Commerce Clause, and I disagree with those interpretations, but I know what the law is. So it would not be a problem, but if I was writing like a law review article, this would be where I wax poetic about. But
then it's a broader problem. Then it's a broader problem, I guess, of Congress in general. But it's not, and I guess Wickard v. Filburn and all this other cases. Like then it's a broader problem of the Commerce Clause interpretation that isn't specific to Joe Biden. The Commerce Clause has been interpreted to allow all kinds of the drug war, the banning of controlled substances. Surely, so what at least under current case law, the issue is not what the it's not an Article 1 issue if Congress spoke clearly, and that's what the Supreme Court addressed. Wasn't that Congress couldn't, if it wanted to, regulate this? It's that they didn't because of major question doctrines, among other things. But what I mean to say is, it's the same argument that you're presenting on Trump in that sense, that they wrote capacious language and the court interpreted it as such, and so what are you so butthurt about it?
Well, I think there are some differences there, but also, I mean, that is why he did it, is because, and in a sense, it's the same answer. If the law can be interpreted that capaciously, that is a badly written law that needs to be looked at, because that's a crazy outcome. So when I say the Alien Enemies Act I don't think that the courts can interpret the term invasion in the way that you're suggesting. I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying we should do something about that law. But if OSHA,
go ahead.
If OSHA actually allows the president to make health decisions for 100 million Americans unilaterally, that's not good. We should do something about that.
Wait a second, but then it's an individual rights problem. Like there are situations in which we need the political branches to have this authority.
You keep defaulting to individual rights. It's a federalism problem. That's my problem.
It's not federalism to the okay. If it's federalism, it's on all fours with all the array of mass amounts of legislation that we have passed that regulate interstate commerce and that precedent. It's not specific to Joe Biden.
You understand what small government lovers want, right? That is the stuff that I think not all, but a large portion of it would be better off left to the states. The vision of the government that people who want a smaller government prefer is one not where these things aren't happening, but where the federal government is limiting itself to the things that the federal government must do, and allowing the states a larger role.
So then I can't understand why, gun to your head scenario, Trump is any better on this front than Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. I just want to address real quick the ivermectin situation real quick.
You don't see the difference between healthcare and border security in terms of executive prerogative?
So I want to address it. So first off, on the issue of healthcare decisions, that's just a question of individual rights. I don't think it should be rational basis. I do think it should be strict scrutiny. And so in the case of having a mandate where there are alternatives, right? It's not you have to get this and nothing else. There are testing requirements in the face of an actual crisis where millions of Americans died. It would have to. So if the president instituted an ivermectin mandate, you go to court and say, this doesn't pass strict scrutiny. You haven't proved that this is going to help the outcome. You haven't offered alternatives for testing, whatever. So that would be an individual rights issue which I think the courts are plenty powerful to resolve. But people underplay the extent to which the COVID crisis was an actual danger for Americans, where, again, I want to stress, millions of Americans died as a result of that crisis. And so with respect to the health decisions, what we're talking about here is promoting vaccines, a mandate that was arguably within the authority of Congress, and it had alternatives where you could just test. And so what is it's not like this complete lack of due process where we're not listening to courts, where we're sending people off before their court dates, where we're waiting until Friday to go in the courts. This was litigated in the courts. There was no indication that Biden was not going to listen to the courts when it happened. There was a good argument, in my opinion, on both this and on the student loans that the statute allowed for that. I think there's a strong argument in terms of the strict scrutiny analysis that I think should apply, that the vaccines would fit strict scrutiny, including the fact that they had the narrow means with respect to the alternative testing route. And so none of this is presented in the same civilizational concerns as Trump proposing to deny due process wholesale and to ignore the courts, and now, right, to flout the courts. What we're talking about is a different prior on how bad the crisis is and what the congressional language allowed for, but it's not the same thing as what Trump is doing right now. What Trump is doing right now is way, way, way worse.
Well, it's definitely not the same thing. I think that, like, I wouldn't use worse, I would use the word egregious. And what I mean by that is what Trump is doing now is like an in your face violation of due process. Like where like there's really where you don't actually need that much due process to deport someone. I'm not sure that like everyone's aware of this, but like in the Obama era, for example, like he used expedited deportation hearings to achieve the deportation numbers he did. And it's because there isn't a ton of due process required there. Asterisks, just because I think it does need to be said. There isn't a big due process requirement because deportation is not a criminal penalty. If you are being deported to a foreign prison, I think that analysis would turn out differently. So, yeah, no, exactly. But under the standard scenario, it's not that much process required, and to flout that is egregious. It's egregious in a very offensive way. So I would agree with you there. The thing about what Biden was doing that made me so incensed at the time, and keep in mind, by the way, this affected me not at all. I was vaccinated already, so it's not like it was like a personal thing. If he was right about that, as we've seen, presidents have been declaring emergencies for all kinds of reasons that we might disagree with going forward. If he was right about that, then the president could dictate healthcare decisions to Americans broadly under any basis they wanted. And it could be challenged in court, but a lot of people felt pressure to do it even before the challenges were resolved. In a world where it was
the government should be allowed to pressure health decisions. You agree with that?
I don't think the president unilaterally should be able to.
So you agree, like washing your hands, that's a health requirement. Saying, for example, that you have to be certified to be a doctor and you can't take these procedures, to say that these drugs are legal, those are not, to have a process by which, we vet drugs and not vet drugs. The government even releasing things and saying, like, we're gonna, if you want to do this procedure, we're gonna subsidize it, or we're gonna give you, like, the government at every opportunity is giving advice, pressuring people to do some things for the health and not other things. Now, sometimes it's improper when you're forcing a medication of some kind. You need to show a really good purpose. But we've had, for example, mandates that public schools can require vaccines. All right. So there is absolutely due process interest in not being forced to have these medications, but there are other alternatives.
If Biden was right about his interpretation of that law, I would see no reason why OSHA couldn't, for example, say it is very, very dangerous to have an Earth that is so overcrowded with what it's doing to the climate. It's very dangerous to have pregnant people at work. If you work at a company with 100+ people, you must be sterilized. Or write us a note to say why you're not being sterilized, and we'll shame you.
So you would run strict scrutiny there. You absolutely would run strict scrutiny there. And the reason we have
I would never even get stricter scrutiny. I would do what the court did and say you're out of your mind. The statute doesn't allow you to do that. You don't even get to the constitutional question.
You're trying to avoid the difficult question. The question is the boring question is, what did Congress actually pass in their statute? And you agree that Congress passed quite capacious language. And the Article 1 issue that you're raising,
despite how capacious it was, it does not permit what Biden attempted to do.
So would you have a problem with the state government? So would you have a problem with New York State, with Texas State doing the same exact thing, forcing these, having a vaccine mandate?
As what Biden did?
Yeah. So
I have a moral problem, but not a constitutional problem.
Oh my! Wait. So the thing is, you're appealing to this kind of intuitive feeling of, wow, the government can force you to have these medications, but that's on all fours in the state case.
No. I'm appealing to principles of federalism.
No.
The idea that the federal government and states are similarly situated when it comes to individual health decisions is just not accurate. That is something that states really have a strong interest in, and the federal government's interest in is kind of tenuous, and I think they should be doing less than they are. But beyond that, the issue is that the president made this decision to interpret a law that let's be honest, you can call it capacious. It was a novel, and I'll be generous when I say novel interpretation, which was struck down by the court for being overbroad. And he did it knowing that Congress would not bless it. Now, if this is the Youngstown
Trump did that
example,
with the border wall, right? Wait, you will agree Trump did that with the border wall? You agree Trump did that with the border wall in his first term. The Republican Congress specifically did not fund the border wall, notwithstanding the fact that it did not have the imprimatur, as you said, of Congress. Yeah. He cited his emergency anyway to redirect funds that were congressionally appropriated to build his border wall.
And I think that's a sign that that's a very dumb law. And I've said that the executive overreach has been continuously getting worse, and that is an example of executive overreach.
It's insane. So in the face of a national emergency to the extent of COVID, right? Like really imagine the worst possible scenario with a health crisis. You want to tie the federal government's hand and say we can't even if we have this life-saving vaccine, even if Congress wanted to, they couldn't pass regulations that affect certain sized employers to require them to either vaccinate or to have testing. You're saying that they don't even have that power?
Well, they obviously, the question that the court resolved is that they didn't, not that they can't. So I don't know whether that's what I mean.
So you're I think painting your concerns as federalism. But when you talk, it speaks as though the problem that you're having is with involving themselves in healthcare decisions. But really, the only problem is, I guess, from a legal perspective, is Congress get involved in healthcare decisions, but you're fine with the states doing so.
The problem is circa 2000, I was promised that the Patriot Act, mass surveillance, and FISA courts were going to be temporary. We still have them, but we needed them because of the emergency. Then you've got, Biden's. I skipped Obama. You have Obama's emergencies of various stripes and the need to pass sweeping healthcare reform through reconciliation, despite the fact that Congress wouldn't agree to it. Then, and not to say nothing of the drone strikes and the use of the FISA courts and all the stuff you can talk about, Obama's executive expansion, followed by Trump 1, where he obviously, as you pointed out, was expanding executive authority again beyond the barriers of what should be appropriate. And I was thinking to myself, holy shit, the world has to catch on to what's happening. We elected this man, and he is clearly pushing the boundaries in a way that is inappropriate. The presidency is too powerful. And we elected Biden, and I voted for him in the vain, and it turns out foolish hope that he would view himself as a Carter rather than an FDR and rein in the power of the office. And he did the exact opposite.
That's such garbage.
He took an action that's like unprecedented in scope in terms of making medical decisions for Americans unilaterally without Congress's imprimatur, and it turns out in violation of what the Supreme Court interprets the statute to be later, granted not violating an order. So I was, deeply disappointed in that. Now, am I surprised that Trump is pushing the boundaries of executive authority? Of course not. He did it in Trump 1. We all knew this was going to happen.
Your problem.
But my hope was that we would learn the lesson, and we didn't.
So you agree, by the way, that Congress, under current existing law, if they wanted to pass a vaccine mandate, and they spoke clearly to that effect under Article 1, keeping in mind the jurisdictional hook of the 100+ employees or whatever the current OSHA regulations are, you would agree that Congress would have that authority if they spoke clearly about it, right?
I think they would under existing Commerce Clause interpretation.
Okay. So under current existing Commerce Clause,
which I find to be a bummer, but yes.
Yeah, so that's current existing law. So the only problem one is a statutory interpretation one, or potentially one regarding individual liberties, due process of the vaccine stuff. So to me, it is outrageous that you can look at Biden's action in a genuine emergency where there is case law supporting that Congress has this authority, and the language in the statute you admit is capacious and is very, very open in a way that you find stupid, right? In a way that you seem to forgive when it comes to Trump, and you just think you'll say, for example, the alien enemy, that's just a stupid law. That's just a stupid law. But you don't do it with Biden. With Biden, when there's capacious language from Congress, you say, oh, that's bad intent. It's obvious that he wasn't allowed to do that. How come you read in the bad bad intent when Joe Biden is looking into some capacious language with respect to a genuine emergency, but you don't see the bad intent when I point to you and say he's not following the Alien Enemies Act. You're saying, well, that's just a bad law, but you don't say the same with respect to Biden. You say it's all Biden's fault and he did a bad thing.
Because local healthcare decisions are not the sort of thing the president should be making, whereas declarations of war and emergency and invasion are the sort of things the president should be making.
That's your ethical judgment. That's your ethical judgment. That's just your normative judgment about what the president should do. It's not legal.
Core federal principles.
No, but you acknowledge that courts disagree with you. The courts disagree with you.
Yes, but the courts also... But the courts also, by the way, agree with me that what Biden did was wrong.
I understand, but at the time he took the action, right? He has the Commerce Clause precedent before him. Yeah. Congress is allowed to establish.
Why did he ask for Congress's blessing?
Why would he need to?
Well, if he got Congress's blessing, he would have been upheld at the court.
His argument,
if Congress had blessed his actions, he would have won that case.
So what? His argument is that it was legal under current existing law.
Yeah, and if he had gotten a resolution from Congress to that effect, he would have won easily.
So here's the issue, right? It doesn't matter whether or not he went to
the reason he didn't is because Congress clearly stated that they were opposed to it. That's why it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. So our process is we don't look to legislative intent of the current Congress unattached to any kind of law, right? Why would we look to the current intent of Congress as explained by who? The Speaker of the House? That should be informative so just to be clear, the originalists, the textualists on the Supreme Court have said, don't look to legislative history, don't look to intent of lawmakers. And now, Ryan, what you're trying to tell me is I should look at the intent of the current day legislators to get to what the law meant that they passed back in who knows when about the OSHA regulations. Why would I care what the current Congress says about that or thinks about it? There's no law.
We've talked about presidential immunity so many times. Have you still not read Youngstown Steel?
We read Youngstown Steel as a matter of course in constitutional law. Of course, I read Youngstown.
Since you've read Youngstown Steel, you are aware that the controlling view of the Supreme Court, I don't understand it was a concurrence back then, but it has been taken up, is that when the president is taking a novel action and we're not sure whether he has authority, the analysis looks to whether or not he is acting within a core capacity, and if he's not acting within a core capacity, the extent to which he has the imprimatur of Congress.
Not the current day Congress. Not the current day Congress. How would we go to look to the current day Congress's opinion about some action related to a law that was passed 30 years ago?
They could, in the extreme, they could pass a law explaining that this is what we meant.
That, right?
They could pass a resolution. This is I'm not exactly sure what the procedural mechanism was, but when Lincoln suspended habeas, like 3 years later, Congress blessed it.
Right? I understand that they could pass a new law. They could pass a new law, but until they do, we should not look. I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to get a definitive answer. Should we ever look to, let's say a law was passed 30 years ago. Should we look towards the current interpretation of the current Congress to divine what the meaning of the law is that we passed 30 years ago? Is that a yes or no?
I think that in the Youngstown Steel scenario, you do.
So is the answer yes? We look to current day Congress's
you read
intents,
the case, right?
Of course, there's many opinions. Yes.
Okay. Yes, it says that. That's what it says.
Where does it say that we look to the current day Congress's interpretation of a previous law? There's no basis for the seizure of the steel mills in Youngstown. In Youngstown, so that was not a Youngstown 2 analysis. That was that was fully out. And also, by the way, at the time it was unclear which is like the controlling opinion. And afterwards, right, Justice Jackson.
The case is a fucking nightmare.
Right. So
it's mainly you can torture.
I have never seen a court rely in large part on the unenacted will of, how am I going to look to the will of Congress in a specific case to interpret the meaning of a law passed 30 years ago? I just don't know how would I look to.
I don't think it would be binding if they didn't pass a law, but you're saying that if Congress passed like a bicameral resolution saying, in this time of emergency, thank God that Joe Biden is saving Americans through the OSHA Act. You don't think that would have been important to the court at all?
No, this court, no.
Oh, interesting.
They say, first of all, they say don't look to legislative history. That's Neil Gorsuch. That's all the originalists. That's number one. I know that it's not a majority originalist court right now, but it's a huge influence. And especially
this wouldn't be legislative history either. But.
Yeah, right. Yeah, don't look to legislative history, but don't look to non-legislative history. Don't look to history of what random Congress people speaking out and saying random shit that isn't even attached to any legislation.
I'm not saying random Congress people. I'm saying that they passed a bicameral resolution saying we approve this action.
But they never did that under Biden, the OSHA stuff.
They never did that because they didn't approve of the action.
Well, no,
that's the problem I'm getting at. Okay. There was opposition in Congress. In fact, he was actually, I don't call them the exact numbers. I forgot what the split was, Republican Democrat at that point.
We had a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate initially, and then eventually there was a Republican House and
I don't remember what it's split.
But the thing is, and Bimble puts a good point in the chat.
The point I'm making is if we look at the current, gotten such a resolution.
This is Bimble's point in the chat, and I totally agree with that. If we look at current Congress, then Congress could change laws without actually changing the law by outlining a new intent. We don't look to the current Congress to determine what the law meant back in the day. That's what they're saying the libs are trying to do, right? That these progressive judges are looking at what and reinterpreting stuff.
A bicameral resolution would take as many votes as it would to pass a new law.
You would need to have,
literally they'd just be saying
it's bicameralism and presentment.
It might be filibuster proof. But I don't know. That's a procedural question. I don't know the answer.
It's bicameralism and present me. So just because Congress and because the House is unwilling to sign off as part of their law on this thing because you have some holdouts in the Senate, or because they just don't want to pass it, or because the parliamentarian doesn't want to pass it, or whatever you want to say, just because that occurs doesn't mean that changes what the OSHA law means. I think it's the height of, and if that were the case, by the way, then these tariffs would not be in place, right? The Republicans have been very critical of Trump's imposition of tariffs.
You understand the difference between Congress being individually critical and actually passing something that is critical.
I'm asking, do you understand that? Do you understand the difference between that? Because
yes.
So if we wouldn't look to the fact that the current Congress disagreed with Joe Biden to
I'm not talking about a press release. I'm talking about them actually passing a resolution.
Yeah, but
I'm not talking about a law. I'm talking about a resolution.
So in the case that you present of Joe Biden passing this regulation or instituting the regulation, we wouldn't look to the fact that the Congress at that time disagrees with it or doesn't or refuses to pass a resolution onboarding it or saying whatever. We wouldn't look to that. We would look at what does the text say, number one, and if the text is ambiguous or unclear, maybe we'll use other canons of construction. Maybe we'll look to what the original public meaning is and we'll look to legislative history. But that's the process that I've been taught that we have to take. So I don't see it. So if you acknowledge that the case law on the Commerce Clause as it is favors that Congress would have this authority if they were clear about it, and if Joe Biden is responding to an actual legitimate crisis and interpreting language that you say is capacious enough, in what sense would this be more bad faith than I think the answer you gave was because it affects health decisions. But again, that's just going to ground down into Massachusetts versus Jacobson.
I don't think I said bad faith. I said massive expansion of executive authority.
In what sense would it be a massive expansion of executive authority other than the fact that if it's authorized by Congress, it was a remarkable situation. It was an emergency. It was a genuine emergency. And there were also alternatives. You didn't have to do that health outcome. You didn't have to get the vaccine. You could just get tested. That was an outcome. So in what you're crying about the imposition on people's health choices, but they could just get tested. And we were dealing with millions of thousands of Americans dying every week.
So it is both the kind of thing that I certainly don't think the president has the unilateral authority to do. He, in fact, did not have that unilateral authority. He could not have gotten blessing from Congress because Congress also opposed it. So yeah, I think it was a huge overreach, and if Trump had done something like that, you would be losing your mind, you'd be losing your mind.
Yeah. So here's the difference.
Of course, you'd be losing your mind. Because it's not the sort of thing we want the president to be able to do.
The merits matter. No, I think that the president in response. So for example, Trump did a bunch of emergency actions in response to COVID. He restricted all immigration. He instituted Title 42 to just push people out of the border without any process whatsoever. He instituted lockdowns in limited capacities. He changed requirements in different respects. He pushed for for other kinds of changes to mask mandates, that kind of stuff. So it absolutely is the case that Trump did you hear me complaining that Trump shouldn't have the power to stop travel
I didn't know you, so I don't know what you're complaining about. But
I'm going to be honest. Yeah. I didn't complain because guess what? I know an emergency when I see one, and also the merits of what is going on matters, right? So if Trump had said, you all need to take ivermectin, I'm going to want to run my individual rights analysis and say, well, hang on. Do we have the proof that ivermectin is this a compelling purpose? Yes. Stopping a pandemic is a compelling purpose. Is this narrowly tailored? Well, is ivermectin shown at all to stop this problem or to help this problem? And the answer is going to be no. And B, is it narrowly tailored? Are you forcing me to get ivermectin to the exclusion of everything else and to the exclusion of testing? So I'm going to run that analysis and I'm going to deal with it on the merits. The problem it seems to be is that there's an unwillingness from some centrists, I have to say, to deal in the merits, in the weeds, and in the good faith of the people behind these actions. So Trump is running on emergency actions in bad faith. He's running on fake emergencies. This was a real emergency. And guess what? At no point did Biden say, I'm not going to listen to the Supreme Court.
The reason I think that we are unlikely to agree on this is because we have a different view of what federalism is and ought to be. When you say, like, for example, Trump changed immigration policies in the face of an emergency, that is the sort of thing I think the president should be able to do. Like, whereas personal healthcare decisions is not the sort of thing I think the president should be able to unilaterally decide. But
the president can affect the FDA, right? The president can ban drugs. The president can say to the FDA, "Don't approve this." So you are. And do you think that there should be no FDA? That the executive branch should not be able to control which drugs Americans take or not take? Is that your view of federalism?
I have not looked at the FDA. I don't have a easy answer to that. I don't know.
That's the president restricting, right? That's the president restricting what drugs Americans are able to have and on what terms. They limit what advertisements you can say on drugs. They say, for example, what kinds of reviews you have to have before you can institute those drugs. In some cases, they ban drugs or they allow for drugs that may be deeply, deeply unsafe. So,
with a much clearer congressional imprimatur.
Understood, but you're saying that the domain of healthcare decision is fundamentally outside of the control of the executive. I say hogwash. The president is in charge of tons of healthcare related decisions of Americans on a day-to-day basis.
What I'm saying is it hits differently when the president is unilaterally doing something in an area where I don't think he has a prerogative, as opposed to him doing something unilaterally in an area where I do think he has a prerogative.
It cannot be as limited as healthcare decisions. It can't be.
I'm not upset when the president unilaterally commands the military, because I expect the president to unilaterally command the military. I do get upset when the president unilaterally does something I don't think the president should have the power to do.
So what if Trump bans all vaccines under the FDA? What would you say?
Bans vaccines under the FDA? I think that would have the same.
All these vaccines are not no longer.
That would have the same problem.
Do you think he has the power to do that?
I don't, like I said, I've never studied the FDA's statute, so I don't actually know what it says.
You wouldn't need to, right? Because
hope not.
If this is an issue of
I hope not.
If this is a problem with inherently with the executive branch being involved in healthcare decisions, it doesn't matter what the congressional statute says. If you're saying it depends on what the congressional statute says, then if Biden were right about the capacious language that you said was capacious, if Biden were right about that, then you can say no, and then you have no problem with it, right? Then Biden's action, right? It's not basically what I'm pointing at. If you're kind of agnostic about the executive's role vis-a-vis the FDA and healthcare decisions, then it's not really an intrinsic problem with the executive getting into the medical decisions, because you're at least agnostic on the president and executive doing so in a large way.
I think the executive branch's role in personal healthcare decisions is or should be minimal. So if these are going to have one, I expect a clear statement from Congress. When the president orders the military around, I don't necessarily expect a clear statement from Congress, because it's the kind of thing I expect the president to do. So
if it grounds down ultimately into whether Congress spoke clearly or not, then it's on all fours. Then if Biden was right, you'd have nothing to say.
It is a crazy goddamn interpretation, and it's in an area unlike immigration, that is one where the president
But you yourself said
the
the language was capacious. You yourself said the language is open to interpretation. That Congress is passing these overly broad statutes. I think the same thing, by the way, with the student loan examples, where Congress, it said waive or modify any provision of this title. That is incredibly broad language to waive or modify any part of the the Higher Education Act. That's insane amount of authority that Congress gave. Notwithstanding that, the fault there, as you identified, was Congress. But if you're okay with, in general, the president being involved in healthcare decisions, if Congress spoke clearly, as it did with the FDA, and it's just very, very broad, then if Biden was right about that, then it's on all fours. That's what I mean. It's not an inherent problem with the president having an effect on medical decisions by Americans. It's a problem with the Congress spoke clearly.
We might be circling, so I'm just going to flag that in case we're just saying the same things. But because I think it's going to boil down to one's view of what the proper scope of federalism is and what you find offensive when that's violated. Like the idea that it was a medical decision versus say a border or security decision does weigh heavily on my analysis. So, I think that doesn't bother you the way it bothers me, but it certainly bothered me.
I think that the President Trump did a lot of things to affect the healthcare decisions of Americans. President Trump greenlit fast funding for a vaccine with Operation Warp Speed. That was affecting the healthcare decisions of Americans in the broadest sense, right? Yeah, go for it.
No, that affects the availability of a medicine.
Yeah.
No decision was
impacted. Authorizing faster funding, faster checks to get a vaccine out as fast as possible, that is inherently going to affect and making it so it's easier for this vaccine to occur and make it occur faster. That is affecting the healthcare decisions of regular Americans. And in the case of the FDA,
wait, you think that doesn't strike you as disanalogous? On one hand, I'm going to make medicine available. On the other hand, I'm going to mandate that you are fired unless you take it, or you submit to testing every 2 weeks and get this mobilization of shame with your employer. You think those are the same thing?
Let's break it apart. I'm asking, what is the proper role for the executive branch in healthcare decisions of Americans? And I'm asking, is this just anything that touches on healthcare? Is it approving drugs, or is it strictly speaking mandating drugs? So I guess I'll ask in this case, if this were just a testing requirement for all individuals under that regulation, would you have the same problem?
I'd have a less of a problem, but I'd still have a problem.
Okay, so
a smaller problem.
So if the problem is the president, you would have a problem even if Congress spoke clearly. Would you say, even if Congress spoke clearly and said the president has the authority to institute, disease testing requirements for employees of this size?
If there was clear congressional imprimatur like that, problem, right? Like what you just laid out, then my problem would be limited to my general gripe with the scope and interpretation of the Constitution that has allowed the creep of the size of the federal government, which is more of a personal me thing than something I'd be yelling and screaming about. The same,
for example, for the president to issue regulations saying you can't use the same wastewater in restaurants of a certain size that are involved in interstate commerce, right? You would have a problem with that regulation on your general grounds, right? That the president be in charge of regulations saying that you can't wash your hands using wastewater. Let's say that were a regulation.
Oh, okay. So that's a great example. You can imagine a spectrum of things, right? If Congress passed a law that said, restaurants should generally be safe, and then the president interpreted that to have a very specific regulation about water pipe fitting and sewage that applied to all 50 states nationally, I would have a problem with that. Yeah. But if Congress said, this executive agency with the proper appointment, blah, 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 shall be in charge of restaurant safety, which shall include standards of water hygiene, I obviously have a much smaller problem.
Yeah, it's not really an executive in the healthcare decisions problem. It's a question of statutory interpretation and who's right and who's wrong about what the statute says.
No, and a question of how much discretion. I think the amount of discretion given to the executive that's proper varies by context.
Okay.
For example, when I'm trying to think of a military law, but I don't know military law that well, unfortunately. If there if the president takes a military action, right? I don't I am less concerned whether or not there's authorizing legislation, because I expect that is the sort of thing the president ought to be doing. When he's doing something that is outside the realm of the things I expect the president to be doing, I want more clear authorizing language.
You don't expect a president in weighing a nationwide international pandemic that is killing millions of people? It is not in the realm of the president of the United States to defend the health and well-being of their people, to institute some kind of guidelines and regulations and mandates, even mandates with alternatives, less intrusive alternatives. That to you doesn't seem inherently in the vein of a president of the United States in the height of a pandemic?
I do not think it's an inherent presidential power, so I am much more searching on congressional authority, because I do not think it's an inherent presidential power. When there is an inherent presidential power, I am less searching, because I think the president has a role in this area anyway.
Oh, okay, but go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I do think we are beginning to circle.
So let's move on to Trump in a second. Yeah.
The other one, I don't want to dwell on it, because I think DEI stuff gets done to death, and I always feel guilty doing it, because I just did a panel on the woke right with Wick where I was just eviscerating the woke right the whole time. So, it's a misapplied term.
Just mention it, so I have an
a great example of this, in terms of like one of the like fringe benefits to someone from like my worldview of Trump is, I think it was 2021, 2020, NASDAQ passed a rule that put like DEI quotas on board membership for listed companies. I think it had an opt-out, like you had to like report why you didn't meet the criteria, but you had to have, I think, at least one woman and at least one person.
That's a stock exchange.
Yeah.
So what's...
No. Let me play it out. In 2024, in December, it got overturned in the Fifth Circuit because we don't need to get into it, but it was correctly overturned. It was never taken to the Supreme Court. And the reason why is super obvious, because when Harvard went to the Supreme Court on affirmative action, the Solicitor General under Biden showed up to go to bat to argue, yes, this is why de facto racial quotas are a good thing. But under Trump, the Solicitor General, if anything, was going to show up and say, this is a terrible rule, it's unconstitutional, get rid of it. There was no reason to take it to the court and lose. It was deeply troubling to me that the Democratic Party found a way to be on the side of racial or gender quotas. That I'm not like, I know there's mental gymnastics people do here. I'm actually fairly simple in this regard. I think racial quotas and gender quotas are bad, and I'm generally against them.
But you know that Grutter is not racial or sex quotas. And are you suggesting that me supporting, or let's say that the president of the United States, as he did, Biden, supports not overturning Grutter, you think that is executive overreach?
I don't think it's executive over. Well, hold on. Let me back up. I think that racial or gender-based quotas or de facto quotas, and this might be more of a moral point than a constitutional authority point, run afoul of core classical liberal principles that I believe in. They are not acceptable.
Okay, but Grutter was the law of the land.
Because they are not acceptable, they should not be defended.
Grutter was not. You agree? Grutter was not a racial quota. That racial quotas are not allowed.
Harvard had de facto racial quotas.
To the extent that they had racial quotas, that would be unconstitutional under the then existing Supreme Court precedent.
They had de facto racial quotas, yes.
But hang on. So a racial quota.
That's why they lost the case.
What do you mean by
de facto racial quotas?
What do you mean by de facto racial quotas? You mean that they had to have this many black people, or that was like their target, or what are you saying?
No, it meant that when they showed the data in the litigation year after year, they had essentially the same percentage of black students who were held to a lower standard. They had the same percentage of Asian students, which were held to a much higher standard. And they were doing it because they were trying to keep a ratio of races for diversity purposes.
Well,
That's
then
incredibly fucked up.
If their intent
that
is
not
to have
remotely okay.
If their intent is to have a racial quota, then that was illegal under then existing standards, and therefore, but also that's Harvard's problem. That's not Biden's problem.
So then, if you think it's illegal, why was Biden defending it?
Biden was defending Grutter. Biden was and Biden maybe was arguing that it didn't amount to a racial quota because everyone knows at the time that racial quotas are unconstitutional. And so if to be defending racial quotas, you would be defending something that the Supreme Court has already ruled on, which is that racial quotas are illegal. But I don't find me where Biden is in court defending racial quotas. He might be arguing that what they're doing doesn't amount to a racial quota, or he could be arguing that they shouldn't overturn Grutter. Yeah. But none of that is executive overreach, and you can't attribute the intention of Harvard to what Biden is doing. If you have very strong proof of racial quotas.
Let's put it this way. The phrase "too many Asians" strikes me as problematic.
Did Biden never say that shit?
No, but that's what Harvard was doing. That's what they were doing.
Okay.
So when it pleases me that were that case to come up to the court today, the Trump administration would show up to say, fuck that. That pleases me that we are past this era of institutionalizing benign racism, if you want to call it that, because it has some noble purpose that people are okay with, which I find odious and deeply offensive, and somehow became a fucking tent pole for the Democratic Party that I was a member of my whole life in the 2020 2024.
Did you agree with busing efforts? Did you agree with racial integration in post civil rights?
I mean, did I agree? I wasn't born.
No, but in retrospect, do you think it was the right thing to do with respect to primary and secondary schools in cases where there were actual racism and historical pattern of segregation for the integration of schools? Do you think that was a proper thing to do, to integrate the schools?
I'm not exactly familiar with the example you're giving. Are you talking about
integration of schools in general? You don't know that?
No, you said busing. Are you asking about Brown v. Board? Or are you asking about
post Brown
forced
v. Board
busing because of de facto segregation? What are you asking about?
Post Brown v. Board, the court ordered remedies that amounted to forced integration of public schools.
Yeah, I think that yes, I'm in favor of Brown v. Board, if that's the question you're asking, which is a strange one, but yes. B, I don't know which remedy you're referring to, so I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about. But like the example I'm most familiar, I'm most familiar with would be a court might, for example, say we've desegregated, but now there's de facto segregation, so you must provide busing such that students can get to the school.
To balance,
is that sort of thing you're talking about?
To balance the races in these places, to get rid of segregation.
To provide access. To provide access.
To make sure that there's no more, to get rid of segregation by affecting the racial balance of the schools. That's the intent.
You understand the difference between access and quota, right? That's a big fucking deal.
I don't know if I understand what you mean by that, so you'll have to explain that.
Yeah. This is not the same example, but maybe helpful. I became a classroom teacher primarily out of social justice concerns. Like, I wanted to do something. I had been working in primarily Black communities in East New York and Brownsville for many years. I wanted to do something to help those communities. So I became a teacher because I thought I could make a difference, right? My motivations were in large part political. I thought that there was an educational gap that was disproportionately affecting Black people, and I wanted to do something about it, right? So that's my goal. When I showed up, I didn't treat white students or Hispanic students worse because they didn't fit into that political goal. Because I want to help. I want to provide opportunity. I want to provide resources. I want to provide access. But I am not going to do something that violates a core principle to achieve that end.
Biden hates Jews and Asians and white people?
My problem with the de facto quota. No, my problem with the de facto quota at Harvard is that they were violating the core principle of just don't be fucking racist in order to combat racism. That's the problem. And that's not defensible.
So what I'm asking for you
is violation.
There are some cases that the court has been clear that there is some cases in which racial-based policies are acceptable. The example that I was giving you that you're fighting me on or that you're unsure about is where there's a historical pattern of segregation that you can point to. Mm-hmm. It becomes acceptable for the government, yes, to on a racial basis to look at the different schools and balance things out on a purely racial basis. So that was one basis which I thought you were going to agree to, that it's okay for the court to order these remedies to correct this past historical segregation in the moment. I thought that you were going to say that it was okay to integrate public schools in the South after segregation.
I did say I was okay with. I did say I was okay with.
No. I'm not.
Education.
Brown v. Board.
The busing.
Yeah.
You were giving you're referencing a very specific series of cases with which I'm not familiar, so I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. So if we're going to be speaking more general terms, there were targeted remedies that were targeted at very specific times to target very specific historic wrongs. Yeah. That is not at all the case in modern education. The reason I'm bringing even if that's fine, I don't see what the point you're bringing up is.
The point I'm bringing up is the analysis does not end at racial segregation racial policy, therefore unconstitutional or illegal. And what the Supreme Court laid out in a series of cases was that racial quotas in higher education is not allowed, and that this kind of generalized, anti-discrimination or rectifying historical wrongs, it's not a la carte. You can't just apply it anywhere. You can't go into the heart of Boston and say, well, the same things from the South apply in Boston, and therefore use that rationale in higher education in Massachusetts. Even though, by the way, Boston's a very racist city sometimes. I just want to be clear about that.
So of course, that is exactly what Harvard was doing and what they tried to argue in court.
To the extent that Harvard was doing a racial quota, it was already illegal under then existing frameworks. I do not believe, and if you want to point me where Biden is defending racial quotas, I'm guessing what they were defending was the policies under Grutter, which said that it's okay to take as diversity as a compelling purpose to give extra favor to people from certain racial groups for the purpose of diversity. Now, if that's the case, right, if that's what's going on there, then I, A, don't see how you can say that that's defending racial quotas if it's not racial quotas. And B, I don't think how you can say that's executive overreach if they're just trying to push for maintaining the Supreme Court law that existed during, for decades and decades.
This is not an executive overreach point. Okay. This is a classical liberal point. But the issue that I'm bringing, that I have with it, and I believe your recollection is largely correct, is that if I recall the facts of the case correctly, what Harvard was doing is that they had a rubric where they put in things like your GPA, your extracurriculars, your writing sample, your test scores, et cetera, and then one of them was like a kind of more nebulous personality metric. And what they were doing in the name of diversity was harshly downgrading their Asian applicants and massively upvoting their Black applicants on the personality metric in the name of diversity, which strikes me as incredibly fucked up. So, yeah,
that's what kind of Grutter allowed for, right? So that's kind of what Grutter allowed for. What you're saying is you disagree with Grutter, you disagree with the diversity rationale, because what does the diversity rationale do? It gives you bonus points if you're underrepresented minority. So it gives you bonus points if you're Hispanic. Yes. It gives you bonus points if you're Black. That's what Grutter does, right? So to the extent that you're finding some kind of policy within Harvard that says bonus points if you're Black, bonus points if you're underrepresented minority, that's just what Grutter allows based on the diversity rationale. Now, the military of the United States for decades and decades said diversity is very, very important. Diversity of thought. Businesses themselves independently have said that diversity is important to them for business reasons.
Not anymore. They're walking that back.
I understand that. So, and we can talk about that because there, I think there is overreach. What we're going to talk about Trump is the reaction to DI is the more authoritarian thing than the policy of the private organizations to institute what was allowed by the Supreme Court. But just in general,
I would actually, I'm going to agree with you on that one. But I think that Trump has overstepped in terms of executive authority. He has overstepped in his countermeasures to DEI. Here is more the kind of like the moral classical liberal case for like, yes, I think Grutter was incredibly fucked up, and it was incredibly fucked up because it was doing exactly what we saw play out in Harvard, where, okay, in the name of diversity, you could line up their applicants. I forgot the exact percentage. I think it was like 14 point something. And like the number of Black admittance to Harvard was essentially by percentage within a margin of error the same year over year over year, because in the name of diversity, they were pumping the personality metrics to ensure a de facto quota. And if that's what Grutter allows, then yeah, I am opposed to that. I'm going to call bullshit.
I love you, Ryan. Then I'm going to say you are so full of shit then, because your whole story is I was promised Biden and he spurned me and he betrayed me. Joe Biden literally said, I'm going to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court. Joe Biden is literally arguably only picking a woman for his vice president pick because she's a woman. So for you to claim, oh, I had no idea that Democrats in general are in favor of Grutter and diversity is fucking laughable. That has been the position of Democrats for years and years and years. You weren't betrayed by Biden. He was open with that.
You keep conflating things I've said as if they were the same point.
Okay.
I expected that he was going to be a one-term president with a mandate to be the adult in the room and rein shit in. That's the executive overreach point. I don't think he did that. I was independently disappointed that the trend that we saw of Democrats in circa 2020 BLM era of accepting what I view as straight up racism as their actual moral compass was also disappointing.
Dude,
and action, I did see that coming.
Affirmative action has been the position of the Democratic Party for decades. And it's all premised on Grutter and other follow-on cases. Some of the intelligentsia is based on the anti-subordination rationale, which has to do with more generalized righting wrongs. And I agree. I think that is not tenable under our current constitutional framework. And I think that it's even acceptable for courts to clamp back on that. But the rationale for decades by mainstream Democrats has been diversity in the courts. And there was never any question that Joe Biden was going to be, against Grutter or
it has been, in general. It has
but you voted for him, notwithstanding that.
It has been a real fucking nightmare. Yeah. So I did, and I was disappointed with how it went. I was disappointed that he didn't take the opportunity to just let Grutter go.
Position this is a candidate who is,
for the record, I was also deeply disappointed in his selection of vice president. Like that was something I was deeply disappointed in.
You voted for him knowing that he supported.
I voted for him on expressly the basis of, holy shit, we've got to get rid of Trump. And I learned over the course of his presidency, well, that was a one-time thing for me. I'm not doing that again. I'm going to vote for people because I want them to be president. Because I did vote against the other guy, and I was very disappointed with what I got.
Okay, I mean, and so those are the two big instances. I think it's like the fact that a Democrat would defend Grutter, would defend diversity. That is the mainstream position among Democrats. I don't think it's a big overreach, and I think you agree it's not a big executive overreach. The biggest executive overreach we have is with respect to OSHA requirements, where you agree. I think that the case law on respect to the Commerce Clause power is in favor of them regulating.
What's that? And the student loan case, but we don't need it. And the student loan case,
kind of thing. The student loan case. I think the student loan case is even better for Biden, where it's the congressional language literally says waiver, modify any. So like you could not ask for more capacious language in that and general provisions in that. And the Supreme Court is now doing this kind of woozy intentionality thing instead of looking at the original public meaning of those terms. I think it's crazy. But
can we do a slight tangent? I know it's fun to yell at each other, but just like a slight tangent. I agreed with the outcome in the student loan case. The standing rationale they gave made no fucking sense to me. Did that make any sense to you?
No, it didn't.
I was like, if you just wait, they've got to be able to find a real plaintiff in like a week or two, right? Like it can't be the case that they can't find a real plaintiff.
It was Mohila, right? Mohila, who, was like, was like a separate entity from the state that was suing. It's Missouri, right? So it was just.
And Mohila, for the non-lawyers, Mohila, to have standing, you have to have essentially a real injury. Like you have to be hurt, not hypothetically, you actually. And Mohila is a state, I believe, agency that was in charge of administering student loans within the state. And in theory, they were hurt by the forgiveness, but they wouldn't join the lawsuit.
They weren't part of the lawsuit.
So the state sued and said, oh, we're being hurt because Mohila's being hurt. But the obvious question is, well, why didn't Mohila join the lawsuit as a plaintiff, which would obviously solve the standing problem. And that was
it was so wild, man. And so this is what I mean. But
that was a decision. Either they just wanted the case very badly, or they have some view that states have some special solicitude.
Yeah, whenever it's Biden, they put their thumb on their scale to stop what he's doing. And guess what? Biden respects it. Trump doesn't. Let's talk about Trump now. Like, okay, you've cited two actions where this, if Biden is allowed to do what he does, right? If he tries to do what he does, it is not going to fundamentally cause a constitutional crisis, right? Because Congress, if it wanted to, can easily rein him in. The court, Biden is listening to the courts. Biden is not defying the courts. People bring up the student loan thing. Absolutely not. There's no way you can say that he's defying the courts, but based on the later actions taken by Biden after he was ruled against.
He was encouraged to, but did not.
Absolutely did not. Yeah. And so there we have two issues where largely it's a policy concern for you, in my opinion. It's not an existential threat to the republic, but in the case of Trump, we do have existential threats to the republic. It's a constitutional crisis in the way that those incidents, you'd have to be bizarre to say they're even on the same level of severity in any respect. So here we have the president, and I want to put this in context. You are still not changing your position on who you would substitute in for the president at this point in time, Kamala versus Trump. The president is talking about
in the gun to my head,
in the gun to your head scenario, recognizing that you didn't vote for either. In this situation, you have no due process given to people who are just being deported. Him talking about deporting U.S. citizens to a gulag in El Salvador. He's going after law firms, a clear violation of the First Amendment, retributing against them because of their private speech, the representation of clients, denying due process and representation or Sixth Amendment rights to their clients, going after contractors because they're affiliated with these law firms, attacking, talk about influence on universities. You think it's the president's role to be managing anti-Semitism on college campuses and encouraging and taking over Harvard's program with respect to anti-DEI and basically having a communist takeover, running the entire country on fake emergencies, on fake invasions that don't stand the historical test. I don't even think you could argue that they stand the historical test, regardless of what a court's able to do. So it is authoritarian encroachment, the likes of which we have never seen, both on the individual rights perspective and on the several branches of government. And so how, in the view of this acute constitutional crisis, which I think now you're starting to acknowledge, or at least I want to get a sense of that, so give me a narrative. How can you not change your answer on the gun to your head thing? But yeah, give me the full narrative on how you see the crisis.
Okay. As I said earlier, my view on the constitutional crisis is that we've had a building constitutional crisis for a long time that Trump is making quite a lot worse. So I don't disagree with you, and I think I used the word egregious earlier, that the stuff that he is doing has a in your face, I am violating this constitutional rule, fuck off, egregiousness to it that I have not previously seen, which is very serious. So I'm not dismissing any of that. And some of those examples, by the way, like the law firms are really interesting. We should talk about that.
Yeah, we should.
So that might be a separate call because that's like a whole fascinating subtopic.
Yeah.
The difference between it's a little tricky to talk about, I know, because we have we move in those circles.
Yeah.
But the difference, I think, in our opinion, is not whether or not there is a crisis. I think we both agree that there is. I think you see Trump as a unique cause of this crisis, and I see it as a symptom of an unhealthy federal system, which will continue to metastasize. So, Trump is uniquely Trumpy and odious and in your face about this stuff. So it might not be that the next guy has the same characteristics, but if we keep expanding executive authority and we keep vacillating between these extreme views of what the federal government should and should not be doing, we are going to endlessly end up in a cycle of presidents pushing these boundaries. It's gotten worse and worse and worse over my lifetime. I would agree this is the worst it's ever been, but I'm really afraid of what happens next. And I think what happens, unless one party or the other is willing to pump the brakes, or we get a Congress, God help us, that is willing, as they have in the past, to just rein presidential authority the fuck in, because right now there's just too much of it. Their president should not be this powerful under any interpretive theory, whether the broad federal theory of kind of like the broader left with the limited agency control, or the unitary executive theory. Neither theory would allow for where we are right now. And we desperately need to do something about it. If a Democrat ran for office on that, I would vote for them in a fucking heartbeat. I'd vote for a Republican that ran for the office on that. It desperately needs doing. The problem is, I don't think either party is interested. Honestly, I don't think either party really wants to.
So if Kamala Harris was president, would we be better off in that regard? In this specific regard?
No, because I don't think she would do that.
So you think that
I think she co-signed the excesses that I found problematic under Biden. I think she would be worse on many of them. I don't think she would have any interest in reigning in the power of the executive. What indication do you have that she would be?
So it's what she would not be willing to do, right? So Trump, for example, has done what he did with these deportations without due process. Do you think Kamala Harris would do that?
Mm-hmm. No, I think she'd do other things that would be continue the trend that I find problematic.
So I want to go through everything, right? So do you think Kamala Harris would do the kind of tariff thing and do the kind of emergency tariffs?
No.
By
the way, do you think Trump would instantiate racial policy into federal spending?
Yeah, he's doing it right now.
I think for sure that would be something that Kamala Harris would be doing.
He's doing it right now. He's doing it right now. He's doing it on the basis of anti-DEI, right? So if you take a view of anti-DEI, right, then he's going to go after you. With respect to the Christians, or I should say the white people from South Africa, he's opening up the door specifically to those refugees, but no other refugees. He's talking about he's building an anti-Christian task force. There's a reason why people are calling him woke. He's doing the same exact thing, but coming from a grievance politics of white people.
I'm unfamiliar with the anti-Christian task force. What are you talking about?
The DOJ is instituting an anti-Christian task force in the sense of going after people where there's anti-Christian bias. He's firing people who he perceives as DEI, right? Yeah. He accused this woman. The reason that there was this crash on DEI. He's absolutely doing the racial that kind of racialization policies just on the other side. So I disagree with that. But go ahead.
But what the thing that was happening on the left that I found deeply, deeply troubling was that these things were, and I will, by the way, very much agree with you, that the left is not egregious or flashy, and in fact is much more savvy in getting their policies into law in a way that might be lasting. But what was happening was the normalization of something like, here is COVID relief money that is only available to people of specific races. And this is a deep problem for me. I mean, when she was running and she had a black men problem, her first instinct was to set aside funds specifically for black men.
Yeah, that was stupid.
Then she changed it. She changed it. So no, I don't think this would get better under her. I think the egregious stuff you're seeing under Trump wouldn't have happened. But I think that the things I found problematic about the Democratic Party would have been built into the federal system under her administration, for sure.
So I just am... I'm totally floored. I mean, you're basically saying you're indifferent between the two vis-a-vis executive overreach. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that they are substantially different. What Trump is doing is wrong, and I'm, fingers crossed, hopeful that what he is doing is going to lead to a voting body that wants to do something to limit it.
Okay, but what who would be worse on executive overreach?
Is that they smuggle the shit in, and only people who are really paying attention see it, and then it's a norm. And then when you say, holy shit, when did this become normalized? Circa 2020, 2024, you were called a racist. That was not okay. This was a very serious problem. So no, I wasn't going to vote for more of that. I certainly wasn't going to vote for more expansion.
I'm not asking that. But what I'm asking is, who would be worse on the issue of executive overreach, Trump or Kamala? Or are you saying that they're about the same?
I think Trump would probably be worse. I think I think the better answer would be they'd be different, but I know you love yes or no's.
I mean,
I don't want to deny you that, Pisco. I can't deny you.
I'm just gonna say,
I,
so
I
if
know
you
you love
agree, if
you
you
love the
agree that
deposition
Trump,
question.
if this is your main issue and you agree Trump would be worse on it, I don't know. How can you say, gun to your head, you wouldn't sub in Kamala at this very moment? If it's your most big issue and you think Trump even is just a little worse, how could you not sub her in?
I'm not yet convinced that he's doing lasting damage, and I think she would have. I think what he's doing is, I think he's doing aggressive things that mostly look like they can be easily undone by a next administration.
So when Chief Justice Roberts comes out and says the rule of law is in danger, does that have any impact on you?
Yeah, it's obviously a problem for me. Like I've explained to you that I disagree with him on all these points, and I have called him out on all these points.
When Reagan appointed judges from like the Fourth Circuit are like citing and saying this cuts to the core of what it is to be an American, that you would do these renditions, the Kilmar Abrego Garcia rendition and the deportation there. That doesn't aren't you seeing the signals everywhere? Don't you see the alarm? Don't you see what's happening to your country? This is great. Like, no, we are in an authoritarian moment right now. As we speak.
I find that very alarming. I absolutely find that very alarming. And also, a deportation policy instituted by a president unilaterally can be reversed by the next president very easily. When you start smuggling these problematic policies into law, that's actually kind of hard to change. When you expand the scope of the federal government, that's actually kind of hard to reverse, as we've seen, because every effort to reduce the scope of the federal government has been met with incredible resistance. So, I think that what he is doing is worse, but largely reversible. My big problem with it, to use your language, is the individual rights problem, because it's when I say it's reversible, I mean it's reversible in terms of policy going forward. The individuals who are getting screwed over by him are unlikely to have regress, and that's fucked up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that's fucked up, because people are going to be locked in this prison forever. By the way, I just want to be clear about where I stand on that. If it's the case that, I don't think it'll come to this, but if El Salvador continues to have people who are held under the authority of the United States or in constructive custody of the United States or on behalf of the United States, and they refuse to hand them over, including U.S. citizens, I think we should go to war with El Salvador and we should invade El Salvador. I just want to be clear about where I stand on that. That I believe that we are managing what's going on in El Salvador, and if under a Democratic administration, El Salvador does not bend the knee and immediately return all of these illegally rendered individuals who have been stuck in their foreign gulag, I believe we should send American troops on the ground to uninstall Bukele as leader of El Salvador and invade that country. I want to be clear about where I stand on that, because it is a vital American interest to protect the integrity of following the law. And for you to sit here, I have to be honest, for you to sit here and say that this is all reversible, it flies in the face of reality. This is not reversible, either at the institutional or the personal level. In the institutional level, the Republican Party is learning that they can do this kind of crazy, like, anti-democracy, anti-republic stuff, and they are seeing where the fault lines are under democracy, and they're going to be better prepared for next time. The people who are true patriots of this country are wondering whether or not we're going to have free and fair elections again. We are wondering whether we're going to have free and fair elections for president again. Trump is talking openly about a third term. They're selling, whether it's a troll or not, you know that the Republican Party, if Trump wanted the nomination again, it would be his. He's talking about deporting, U.S. citizens. They're saying the president can do no wrong if he protects his country. He does not violate the law. J.D. Vance is saying openly that they should violate court orders. This is not easily reversible. This is very, very, very hard to reverse. The descent of our country to authoritarianism.
You've broadened from policy to cultural fabric. Like, I mean, I don't know whether or not what the Republican Party is going to do in the future. This is what I was talking about with Wick. The infighting about the term woke right, I find actually quite heartening. The last time I talked to Destiny, he said to me, he didn't think there was any fracture lines in the right. And I was saying, are you kidding? You don't see this coming? And it absolutely, you can see it coming. Because months ago, there were, I think the litmus test I was applying back then was, are you a Republican who, because Justice Barrett voted against Trump once, thinks she's not Republican enough for you? and you could see who they were back then, and now we have a term for it, which is great. Will that play out? Who's going to win that civil war? What does the party look like going forward? I don't know, but that is a cultural issue. When I'm saying it's reversible, what I'm talking about is like the next president can just not have the same deportation policy. It's not a law. There's nothing that forces the next president to do this. He's governing through executive orders, which
what about the
gives
administrative
him
state?
a lot of
He's eviscerated the
nimbleness.
administrative state. That's going to take years and years to rebuild in a way that is, unless you are you in favor of what Doge is doing?
In terms of what they've actually done, or in principle.
Both.
In what they've actually done, they appear to have stepped on every rake imaginable and wasted an incredible opportunity. What I do support is, and they're less sexy, so they're not talked about as much, but like the executive orders that Trump has passed, where he says things like, I need you to name every single regulation that has a criminal penalty. Or if they say, I need you to deregulate in light of Chevron deference being overturned. These are, I think, very good efforts. It's what Doge should have been focused on. And if they had focused on that first, they would have done a lot better. But yeah, I favor a smaller federal government. So it should be unsurprising to you that favor deregulation.
They're deregulating for their corrupt ends. Like the level of corruption we're seeing in this administration is unparalleled. Trump is openly having quid pro quos with like Mayor Adams. He's taking this $400 million.
Dude, don't even do that. If you want to say Trump is like
super corrupt,
if Trump is uniquely corrupt, do the meme coin. That's by far the best.
Meme coin, like this. Our credibility has been scarred permanently. Like our credibility to our allies has been scarred permanently. People are moving away from America. America is losing its allies. Canada, Australia, European Union, they're moving closer to China. This is all irreversible. It's going to take decades to clean up this fucking mess because people don't open their eyes and see the presidency is an office that's held in trust for the American people. And what Trump is doing is uniquely corrosive and damaging. That's why these judges are all coming out insane in so many words. I'm at a loss.
The corruption point is one where I'm going to agree with you. I think I was trying to think of like what would I look for in terms of like a historical parallel to the meme coin in terms of like the corruption risk. And I think you're talking like Teapot Dome. Like it's really
worse.
bad.
Because
the problem is it's like it's essentially we'll never know how much bribery was in that pot. It's unknowable, and which is obvious. Like the problem there is beyond clear. So I mean, there I'm going to absolutely agree with you. I'm very much hoping, and fingers crossed, I never get what I want, but I'm very much hoping that this presidency causes the American people to want to take some bitter pills and say like, we need to rein this shit in. It has to stop. We need to get rid of the laws that empowered the president to be.
Here's the problem. If J.D. Vance were up for an election and Kamala Harris won the nomination again, you'd vote for J.D. Vance. Or, sorry, maybe you won't for neither, but you'd still say you'd gun to your head, you prefer J.D. Vance.
If Kamala Harris was the nominee? Yeah, probably. But if Kamala Harris was the nominee, the Democratic Party has learned fucking nothing. Like what I want to see is them find some new blood who are not mired with the very bad ideas that destroyed the party in 2020 to 2024. Have somebody who can come up and credibly say, I honestly think the first party that can get to a general election and credibly disavow their fringe wins. Because
you think Kamala Harris is on the fringe of the Democratic Party? She's a centrist.
She did not credibly disavow. Like for me, I did not believe that because she ran as a progressive, and then she tried to pivot to center unconvincingly. In the election.
She walked with Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney. She's talking about doing things that are like what is she talking about that's so fucking radical? I mean, she's in favor of harsher borders, tough on crime stuff. Like she is not running as a crazy. She's not running for Medicare for all.
We knew who she was already. What she had to do and didn't do was have like a Sister Soldier moment where she actually disavowed the fringe elements that I believe she would have been beholden to had she been elected. And I believe that
what do you
because
say about
when she
Trump?
ran
I
for
mean, like,
president, that's how she ran.
Trump
It's not
has
like I'm
fucking
making this up.
Laura
That's how she
Loomer.
ran.
Trump has Laura Loomer firing generals in the Oval Office. Trump is. Do you understand the level of fucking incompetence and crazy people who are with this administration? Look at Signalgate. Wake the fuck up, Ryan. Your country is being stolen from you right now by the craziest people on the fringes of society.
This is exactly why I actually, and God bless, I'm so happy for your channel. I'm so happy you're growing, but I very much worry that, and I chide you about the over aggressive approach and the way you approach this. The reason is exactly this. What happens is everyone goes to their own corner, and the right's corner is more cohesive. When the left wins, it's because they can articulate a clear, common sense vision that's going to for the future that makes the country better, that people believe. That's how Obama won. That's how Clinton won. The problem right now is, as unpopular as Trump is, the left is even more unpopular because they can't get rid of the baggage of these fucking terrible ideas.
I'm not talking about
such.
I'm talking about you,
disavows.
Ryan. I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about you, Ryan. And sorry, I am talking about you, Ryan. I'm not talking about the Democrats' approval rating.
You just yell at me saying my name.
I'm talking about you and your choices and your preferences. I'm saying, look about you talk about radicals, right? The Democrats right now are being headed by Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, who Chuck Schumer okayed a CR where he was lambasted by his party. They're being run by the same establishment institutional Democrats. It's actually pissing people off that they're not listening to the people who want more fighters. The Democratic Party aren't pissed off at the Democrats because they're too radical. They're pissed off at the Democrats because they're not fighting hard enough. And for you to compare the Democrats in the state that they're in terms of vis-a-vis their radical base, when you have Trump is listening to the craziest people. He's installing Jeanine Pirro as the interim DC U.S. attorney. He's installing Kash Patel as the FBI director, Dan Bongino as deputy FBI director. Open your eyes. The crazy asylum people are running the show. Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. If you want to talk about the relative fringes of the parties, if by definition you mean that the Trump crazies are now running the show in the Trump party, I guess they're not the fringe anymore. It's all fucking open in your face. But the Democrats are the party of sanity. And if you're failing to see that, I think that you and I are living in different Americas. I truly think that we're seeing different Americas.
The woke right is obviously a reaction to the woke left, and there'll be another reaction after that, and the vicious cycle will continue unless someone stops it. But the left hide themselves to a basket of truly terrible ideas during 2020 to 2024.
Name them besides the EI. Besides the EI. Name it.
Okay. So you want to talk about women boxing men? How about that one?
When was that a major policy? How was that a major policy implication?
It was Trump's most important political ad. It's what he won on.
No. I'm asking you as a smart person. Sorry. I don't want to talk about optics and what caused people to vote for one. I'm asking you as a smart, intelligent person. Do you think I'm asking you as a smart, intelligent person, do you think the Democrats were going to install any policy that made those outcomes more likely?
I'm sorry. I can't let that one go. The reason you don't want to have that conversation is because these ideas are obviously bad. They're obviously bad. Like when I saw Biden defending fucking racial quotas before the Supreme Court.
Where is he defending racial quotas? Okay, now I'm going to call you on it. We're going to find actually the filing where it says racial quotas and Biden is defending racial quotas. As understood, the term racial quotas, I want to be clear about what you mean. Would you consider the Grutter style giving additional points for diversity? Would you consider that a racial quota?
If you use that to create a de facto quota, then yes, which is what Harvard was doing.
I mean, okay, but oh god. So when you say Biden was defending racial quotas, you mean what exactly? That he was saying that when he argued that Harvard's policy wasn't a racial quota?
He chose to send the Solicitor General to intervene in a case that is optional, by the way. He did not have to do that in order to defend the practice of universities using soft metrics to create de facto racial quotas. That's what Harvard was accused of doing.
I'm looking up the SG's brief right now. Just hold, please, and let me know when you have to go. But just a heads up.
It is like 12:15, and I have work tomorrow, so okay. I probably should go.
Can you give me 10 more minutes? Is that possible?
Yeah, okay. We can also to be continued this one.
100%.
Totally unrelated, but since you're looking this up, you and Wick obviously won the free speech debate, which you should have, because you had the better facts law, which makes it somewhat easy to win, dude.
Yeah, wild, huh?
When your case is that strong, 15% less intensity.
Okay.
Like, because like, because like when I was watching it, I was just like, well, obviously he and Wick are right, but like, you were yelling and fighting so much, I was like, oh shit, is there actually something to fight about? Like, like, are there two sides to this? It actually feels
I was more
like
mad at the moderation, and because I like it better when I'm by myself. Okay, let's see what they said, what they were arguing. So let's see, quota.
I do not have all of these documents in front of me, so I'm not sure what we're going to achieve with this, but let me know what you want to do and I can try to find something.
Okay, this is what they argued in court. The lower courts held that Harvard's limited consideration of race satisfies strict scrutiny. Petitioner challenges that holding largely ignores the lower court's detailed factual findings. Petitioner first asserted that Harvard engages in racial balancing, but the district court found that Harvard has not attempted to achieve classes with any specified racial composition. The court further found that racial composition of Harvard's admitted class has varied from year to year in a manner inconsistent with the imposition of a racial quota or racial balancing. So you would agree, based on that statement from so here, another quote. The Court of Appeals agreed, noting that the share of Asian Americans, Black, and Hispanic applicants who are admitted fluctuates more than does the share of those applicants in the pool, which is the opposite of what one would expect if Harvard imposed a quota. You agree, therefore, that the SG was not arguing that racial quotas were a good idea, but that, in fact, Harvard did not have a racial quota. You agree with that now, right? If what I said,
I have almost no idea what you just said. If you want to deep dive these documents, let me read 100%. Them, and we can come back.
So I just want to be clear about what I'm citing for the people here, and I want you to read it, right? So the SG here is arguing, in my opinion, based on that reading, is that the district court level, the lower courts, found that Harvard does not impose a racial quota and that they're not doing racial balancing. And so therefore, if the SG is arguing that the district courts and the lower courts are not doing racial quotas, you know what the SG is not doing? Arguing that there should be racial quotas.
All right. I am happy to take that argument and look at the stuff and see what I think about it.
If I'm right about that, so if I'm right that the SG wasn't arguing in favor of racial quotas by saying, in fact, that Harvard doesn't have racial quotas, you would retract that argument against Biden, fair?
Sorry, say that again.
If it's the case that the SG, who's on behalf of the president of the United States government, if they're in court saying that Harvard's policy does not violate the Constitution because it does not amount to a racial quota, because you don't see the things that you would expect with a racial quota, it would be disingenuous, wouldn't you agree, to argue that, in fact, Biden was arguing in favor of racial quotas, right? That would be disingenuous?
It would depend on the facts and circumstances of the case.
Okay. Well, listen, I think that...
For example, if Trump shows up in court and is arguing that there's no problem because there actually is an invasion, I'm sure you would say that you have to look at the facts and circumstances, not just what he says.
I can see if it's an obvious bad faith, but the district court in this case appears to have found that it's not a racial quota, as did the Court of Appeals.
Well, the district court was overruled, so
I understand that because Grutter was overruled.
Yeah,
but Grutter doesn't allow for racial quotas.
So that's what I'm saying. I would need to, but I'm not prepared to have like a super deep dive on this, which would be fun. I'd like to do it.
All right, let's do it.
What I would need to do is read the district court opinion, read all the briefs, re-listen to oral argument. I listened to it at the time, but it was a long time ago. So I'd need to like hear it again or read the transcript. But I'd be happy to do it. That'd be fun.
So the SG, by the way, argues that using racial stereotypes to penalize Asian Americans is not allowed, and that Grutter doesn't permit it, and Harvard has never argued otherwise. And basically what the SG is saying is this fits into Grutter. The Supreme Court overturned Grutter, and I don't see this as Biden arguing in favor of racial quotas, and I do think that we should schedule a conversation specifically to determine whether, in your opinion, Biden was sending the SG to argue in favor of racial quotas, or if, as I presume and what I suspect, that Biden was in court arguing that this was Grutter, not racial quotas.
The phrase I used was to defend the practice of de facto quotas, but yeah, we can have that conversation.
Okay, and I just want to cite this for the people in the chat. If you go to, I'll put the link in the chat in a bit, but I acknowledge that it's late for you. Listen, we have more to talk about. Let's make a part 2 on this. I really enjoy this. You get me so fiery, man, because you're a smart guy, and I want you to see the way I'm seeing it, and it really bothers me that someone as smart as you, who I respect, I think is doing this whataboutism that's going to destroy our country.
I know you hate it when I do this, but I do think part of the reason I pivot sometimes in these conversations to optics and tactics is because when everything has to boil down to a yes or no answer, you often lose the points where we obviously agree, and we're going to be calling out the same thing. And I know that is part of like the shtick, but I think that I'm very hopeful that one party or the other shows up as the adults in the room. And I think the way to do that is I think we have differing opinions on how to accomplish that goal. So I'll leave it at that. But I enjoy these conversations, man. I hope
Likewise.
you're having fun wherever your travels are taking you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and let's talk again soon, okay?
Yeah. The other thing we got to talk about is the law firm stuff, because that's like crazy. Yeah. But let's DM about how appropriate we think that is, because that's like very close to the line for like what I'd be willing to talk about publicly.
Yeah.
So
I hear you. Okay. I'm gonna send a little bit, but let's talk about it in DM, and we'll talk soon, okay, man? Appreciate the convo.
Good seeing you.
Later, bro. Exit out the call. Oh my God, guys. Okay, so this is what you guys got to do. All right, hang on. I'm gonna actually. We're gonna show this, right? So we're gonna show this. What Ryan was arguing is that Biden was saying that he's in favor of racial quotas. Okay, so we're looking at the Harvard admission policy, right? And the question is whether or not Biden is arguing for racial quotas. What I present to you is the following. Let's go to sub B here. Petitioner fails to show any error in the lower court's application of Grutter and Fisher. Okay. The lower courts held that Harvard's limited consideration of race satisfies strict scrutiny. Petitioner's challenges to that holding largely ignore the lower court's detailed factual findings. Petitioner first asserts that Harvard engages in racial balancing, but the district court found that Harvard has not attempted to achieve classes with any specified racial composition, right? That's not racial quotas, right? Racial quotas are specified racial compositions. The court further found that the racial composition of Harvard's admitted class has varied from year to year in a manner inconsistent with the imposition of a racial quota or racial balancing, right? The Court of Appeals argued, noting that the share of Asian American, Black, and Hispanic applicants who are admitted fluctuates more than does the share of those applicants in the pool, which is the opposite of one would expect if Harvard imposed a quota. Petitioner has not made the very obvious and exceptional showing of error that would be needed to reject the lower court's concurrent factual findings. So this is not saying that they support, right? This is not support for a racial quota. This is not saying quota good, right? This is the SG brief, by the way. This is the United States' brief. So this is not them saying that this is, Hunter says, I sent you the link to the Harvard analysis as well as the score and rubric for applicants, the way they're adjusted to your Discord DMs. Would love to see you check the rubric. Maybe. This is not support for racial quota. This is saying quotas are bad. We know quotas are not allowed, and this is not a racial quota. So for you to construe, right, unless there's some additional evidence, thank you so much for this up, that this is the U.S. government this is U.S. under Biden, that this is Biden in court, arguing in favor of a racial quota. That's not what this is doing, right? This is saying that the district court found that Harvard did not impose a quota. At no point are they arguing that racial quotas are good, that we should have racial quotas. They're saying this does not amount to a racial quota. Why? Because the features that are consistent with the racial quota are not present. You guys following me here? Let me know if you're following that. Imagine, right? Imagine if this were the case. Imagine that we go into this actual next discussion with Ryan and he says, actually, yeah, you're right. Biden wasn't arguing in favor of racial quotas. What's left? Just that OSHA thing that we talked about for all that time? Pisco, it's brain rot and just vibe-based. I actually feel like I'm losing I'm losing my marbles. I lose my mind when people use Harris not just directly calling out the far left extremists as an excuse to vote Trump. Yeah, it's crazy. In assigning the overall raters, readers may consider whether a student's background, including his or her race or ethnicity, may contribute to the educational benefits of diversity. The consideration of race or ethnicity may be considered only as one factor among many. That is not, by its terms, a racial quota, right? So you guys agree? That, by its terms, is not a racial quota. Biden was explicitly against racial quotas and has been for like 50 years. Dude, did we just get a conspiracy on Ryan? Is this a Ryan conspiracy? The Ryan conspiracy. Is Ryan spreading misinformation? The Ryan conspiracy. His argument would probably be that by saying Harvard didn't have a racial quota, they are defending some kind of quasi quota that in his opinion did exist, which is a choice. I guess, but this is like more... Really? But Trump talking about deporting U.S. citizens and about terminating the Constitution, this statement on DEI where it's saying we don't support racial quotas, but just assuming the intent to, like, think about how much charity he gives to the Trump position, where it's like, yeah, but technically there's a very wide latitude law, acknowledging the same for the OSHA stuff, but notwithstanding that, and saying that like this was a crazy excess. And then pretending, right, that he's shocked at how Biden ran, but you voted on Biden, and you know Biden is in favor of diversity. I don't know, man. This is all, to me, it's all just wild. This is all just wild, I have to say. For someone like that to say, yeah, maybe Trump is worse on executive overreach, I still wouldn't substitute Kamala Harris, even though Trump is worse on executive overreach, because none of the damage is permanent. None of the damage is permanent. Imagine that's your position. It's enough that he's worse, right? Shouldn't it be enough that he's worse on executive overreach if that's your biggest issue? But the DEI concerns, which are not about executive overreach, this DEI stuff is like, damn, dude. And now Trump is instituting his own version of DEI. What's going on with my country, man? What's going on with my country? There's no possible Democratic candidate he would concede is moderate enough. Yeah, I mean, like, he would vote for J.D. Vance over Kamala.